So welcome back. We hope you had a nice lunch, and for me it was really great to see you kind of interact and get to know each other because, like Miri mentioned, this is why we're here. So the next part of our program is going to focus on technology, and I'm going to be your first speaker for this session. I didn't really introduce myself before. I'm a neuroscientist in training. For the last few years, I've been active in technological innovation of different sorts. And what I want to share with you is really just a useful framework to keep in mind while you're reading and hearing, even here today, about the different technologies in the space. So in this session, you're going to hear from a few speakers about different types of technologies. And obviously, this is the tip of the iceberg, both in terms of the number of technologies that are out there and the depth of information that you can read about and get about each technology. And this phrase, enabling technology, we hear it a lot. And what it generally means is technologies that can be applied in order to drive significant change, either in the capabilities or the performance of the user. And in our space, these technologies are usually roughly divided into two categories. Miri mentioned it today earlier. We usually divide them into sensing technologies and manipulating technologies. So sensing technologies are technologies that are meant to detect and usually afterwards also quantify and analyze specific physiological or behavioral or emotional parameters. So this can be EEG to monitor brain activities. It could be galvanic skin response sensors in order to check the condition of your skin. Usually it refers to sweat. And this information is taken, is analyzed, and conclusions are deduced. And many times these technologies are also associated with some recommendation to the users about their state. The second category of technology, the manipulating technologies, are really technologies that are meant to change the user's state. And that could be a behavioral change, it could be an emotional change, it could be a physiological change. And the interesting thing is that many of these technologies really target our senses. So examples for technologies that employ sensory stimulation to elicit change can be VR, obviously using visual cues, but also many times in order to be very immersive, they also use auditory cue and haptic stimulation. Also aromatherapy is sometimes used in order to kind of create an auditory, olfactory stimulation. So I think it's obvious for many of us, or intuitive for many of us, that these sensory stimulation would cause maybe an emotional response or a behavioral response, but we see more and more in studies that these sensory stimulation also cause a very clear physiological response. They change blood pressure, they change brain waves. They have a very, very profound effect. Now, another class of another class of manipulating technologies is brain stimulation. And you can look at it as technologies that instead of taking a detour and affecting our brain through the senses, they just directly affect the brain. So there's non-invasive and invasive brain stimulation, but for our space, the non-invasive brain stimulation is more relevant, and you can read a lot about it today. There's a lot of, I don't know if to say various sorts, but different kind of variation of the same non-invasive brain stimulation technologies. So I've talked about the sensing and I talked about the manipulating, but what we see is that the really interesting things are happening when you interact between sensing technologies and manipulating technologies. So these are technologies, it could be a technology or a combination of technologies that initially assesses the user's state and then creates some sort of manipulation in order to drive this state in a specific direction. And then what usually happens is that we reassess the user's state, and if needed, we remanipulate and reassess and remanipulate, creating a loop. And these technologies are referred to as closed-loop technologies. And the goal of closed-loop technologies is really to keep the desired state constant. So one class of interesting closed-loop technologies that you're going to hear about today is neurofeedback. So there's neurofeedback focusing on our brain, and biofeedback focusing on other biological kind of markers, let's call them. So the interesting thing about bio and neurofeedback is that it does this closed loop thing that I was talking about, the sensing and the manipulating, but the manipulation is not done by a technology. It's really done by the user's own volition. So you'll hear about it and hopefully read about it because this is a technology that is super relevant for this space. So the next speaker is going to talk to you about VR and AR, and I have to share with you that we were super delighted when we called Jonathan and asked him to give this talk after receiving many recommendations about him as a VR expert. And what we found out is that he himself is a JoyMaker and he's part of the program. And I'm really happy to welcome him, Jonathan Schiff.